New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we will be exploring parapsychology as a deviant science. With me is sociologist James McClenon. He is the author of Deviant Science, the Case of Parapsychology. His other books include Wondrous Events, Foundations of Religious Belief, Wondrous Healing, Shamanism, Human Evolution, and the Origin of Religion, and The Entity Letters, a sociologist on the trail of a supernatural mystery. Once again, this interview is being conducted via Skype, so now I'll switch over to the Skype video. Welcome, Jim. It's a pleasure to be with you once again. You've really spent your whole professional career looking at the paranormal from the perspective of the science of sociology.
Well, I started out as a sociologist of science, and we'll have to talk about that today a little bit. I'm more of a sociologist of religion these days. Mm-hmm.
But that's pretty close. I mean, because I don't know of any religion that doesn't incorporate into its sort of founding ideology the notion of what we call the paranormal or the supernatural.
Well, that's true. Yes, very much so. Yes.
And the unique thing about parapsychology is that parapsychologists are saying this acceptance of something beyond what can be explained in terms of physical science, nevertheless can be studied using the methods of empiricism.
Yes, yeah, most definitely.
And I gather that's where the problem occurs. In your book, Deviant Science, you point out that many segments of the scientific community are unwilling to accept empirical data when it comes to extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, and survival after death.
Well, yes, and so I was a graduate student at the University of Maryland, and they assigned me to teach in the field of deviant behavior. I was theoretically going to be an expert in deviant behavior. So then I kind of hit upon this field, the field of parapsychology, and I was pondering it as a form of deviant behavior and put together a kind of a theoretical model that I hoped would explain it. And I started off with what scientists were writing about, what sociologists were writing about science. And the cornerstone of everything was Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Mm-hmm. And Kuhn argued that scientists come upon anomalous phenomena, and then that eventually brings them to, make a scientific revolution. So it would seem that might be appropriate for parapsychologists. They're trying to make a kind of scientific revolution. But if you read into the sociology of science, Michael Malke had another important book, The Science and the Sociology of Knowledge. And he pointed out that there's a kind of a rhetorical and political process, that there's a relative quality to science. It's not as objective as you might think. So the scientists are engaging in their activity and they're coming across anomalies. And then they engage in a kind of rhetorical and political process, and particularly the social scientists, psychology and sociology, there's a lot of politics and rhetoric and that something which is in fashion during one era goes out of fashion, and then the scientists move on to something else. So there's scientific revolutions, but it's not as objective as you might hope. And then he was also arguing that that's also the case in physics. There's a political process. So in 1979, I traveled around the country and interviewed parapsychologists all over the country: California, Texas, Virginia, New York. And I saw something that seemed to be a little bit different. In other words, it seemed that the phenomena that parapsychologists were looking at were a kind of rejected anomaly. So I put
a rejected anomaly as opposed to an anomaly that gets embraced.
Yes, an anomaly that draws interest. A typical scientific revolution attracts attention of scientists. They make their careers in the field. They become, they get tenure. They become famous, and the anomaly is accepted, and then the anomaly is explained, and the scientific revolution occurs. And it doesn't take that long a time. It takes maybe 10 years or 15 years, and the process occurs. But parapsychology in the 1980s, when I was doing this, it had been going on since 1934 with J.B. Rhine. So it was what I refer to as a deviant science. I was in the field. Now, I have to admit that when I was in graduate school, my first objective was to get a PhD and get a decent job. That's what I hoped would happen. So I was working with what I had, and I had these different theories in sociology. And if you want to graduate, you have to do what they tell you to do in a way.
Yeah.
So we're going to use the theories of sociology to try to explain the phenomena, but it wasn't fitting very well. That apparently some anomalies are rejected. So I created a kind of theoretical model, and we have rejected anomalies, and that leads to stigma for the scientists. And then the scientists somehow have to support themselves. So the field of parapsychology is being supported by, benefactors, by lay groups which are supporting the field. And then, so all these, there were some, 30 some research centers, and they were being supported by lay groups and continuing J.B. Rhine's paradigm.
Well, so the anomaly that you saw is, I gather, that parapsychology shouldn't have survived as long as it did without being embraced by the mainstream at some point.
They would either be successful or they would fail relatively quickly. So it seemed something unusual is going on, and it would seem that there's a certain kind of anomaly which is rejected by science. So the question is, why is that? And I don't know. We'll have to talk about that a little bit, But it would seem that, so these scientists are being stigmatized, and then I traveled around and thought they would constitute some kind of cult-like behavior. But that wasn't at all the case. The parapsychologists were embracing science more than normal scientists. And so we have the term scientism, the concept that science has some kind of hidden ideology which is justifying its practices. And so the parapsychologists, in a way, they were embracing scientism. They were trying to become more scientific than the regular scientists.
Which is not what you expected to find.
No, I expected it to be like a religious cult, to be people who were embracing an ideology and looking for data to support that ideology. But that isn't what they were doing at all. They were trying to figure out what the phenomena was to the degree that's possible within the confines of regular science.
And now, the fact that parapsychology has persisted, and I think it's fair to say if you include psychical research, the Society for Psychical Research was founded in 1882. So we're talking about 136 years of scientific investigation into mediumship, altered states of consciousness, paranormal phenomena, psychokinesis, extrasensory perception, survival after death. Your sociology studies would have suggested to you that this should not have lasted so long. And yet it dawns on me, take the Copernican revolution in astronomy, the idea of a heliocentric solar system. that took, I think, many hundreds of years.
But there wasn't the same kind of scientific establishment in those days. Yeah. And there wasn't the same power within scientism. Science has a certain power in modern society. It's aligned with secular forces and secular belief systems. And so there's a large number of people participating in the endeavor. And so they have a hierarchy among themselves. And so that was my idea, was to try, and then the nature of what they reject would then define scientism. We could determine what's allowed and what isn't allowed by what's being accepted and what's being rejected. And it would seem that this psychic phenomena was definitely being rejected. In fact, I found it myself. I got my PhD, and it turned out, my advisor said, well, we called it deviant science, so people realize that you're an expert in deviant behavior. But I went for job interviews, and they said, well, there's certain things we can't really allow in the classroom, and this is one of them. Mm-hmm. And so you're not going to get a job, So the stigma is very, very intense. So if you're going to go into this field or even study this field, you're going to pay a very stiff price. Mm-hmm. There's going to be a penalty involved. And one thing that I did as part of my dissertation was send out a questionnaire to the elite members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And that stimulated a huge amount of feedback. About 5 or 6 of these elite scientists sent letters to the University of Maryland and tried to get me kicked out of graduate school. It was a very, very strange experience for a graduate student, mm-hmm. fledgling sociologist. Yeah. And I was somewhat depressed, but at the same time a bit thrilled. It seemed that I was putting my finger on some kind of strange nerve, which has not been recognized, or people hadn't thought about it. We understand there's a fear of death, and sexuality is certainly an issue. Deviant forms of sexuality. Minority groups are fearful. Some people are very afraid of minority groups. And here's something which stimulates a very, very intense fear from elite scientists, asking them questions about extrasensory perception.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting you should mention the fear factor, because after all, it's been only a little over 200 years, I believe, since here in the United States we were burning witches at the stake.
Yeah, so now we've turned our attention to immigrants and gay people and minority groups and people such as parapsychologists. but we're not burning them at stake, though we are putting children in cages. That's a little bit distressing. Yeah. But so I sent out this questionnaire to the elite scientists, and then that gave me a chance to compare that data with previous similar studies. You ask them, what's your attitude towards extrasensory perception? And it turns out a very small percent considered ESP an established fact. And among the elite scientists, it was 3.8%. And among regular college professors, it's 16.3%. So there's a big difference. And to consider extrasensory perception a likely possibility, 25% of the elite scientists and 49% of the regular college professors. So there's a big difference. And so there's something associated with the social status within science that creates this. In other words, the people who are these elite scientists are the judges. They're the ones who determine whether your result gets published or not.
Mm-hmm. Well, in your book, you talk about a very interesting episode in which the American Association for the Advancement of Science was petitioned by the Parapsychological Association for formal affiliation. That was back in 1969, and after a very heated debate, actually, the Parapsychological Association was admitted as an affiliate scientific organization. So that conferred a measure of legitimacy, I should think, on parapsychology.
Well, most definitely, but there was an issue which was not completely settled per se. In other words, Margaret Mead stood up and made a wonderful speech, and everyone applauded. And the parapsychologists did a huge amount of incredible lobbying, and that really is how they were successful. The question is, why does a scientist believe in extrasensory perception? What causes a scientist to come to accept it or not?
Yeah.
And so I got a certain insight to that because I had this questionnaire that I was planning to mail out to them, to the elite scientists, and I took it to scientists at the University of Maryland, and I sat with them in their office, and I would give them the questionnaire and watch them as they filled it out.
Mm-hmm.
I would ask them questions. Why do you think the way that you think? Now, the first thing that I found was a lot of them were just really angry at me. This was taking up their time, and they had better things to do, and that I really should realize that what I was doing was just basically wrong, and I should be punished in some way. Yeah. But then there was one scientist who had he felt he had made a discovery about gravity waves, and this had turned out to be a false trail. He'd made a something was wrong with his methodology. And he particularly was sensitive and was really anguished that I would come to him with this thing which seemed even worse than what he had done, But I remember there's an insect expert, an expert in spiders, and he had all kinds of sample different size spiders in his but most of them were deceased, but and all kinds of books about spiders. And he sat down and started talking to himself and saying, what do I think about extrasensory perception? Is it possible that our minds can be connected to each other? And he was silent, kind of pondering that question. He said, well, compared to spiders, this isn't really that difficult, Think about how small a brain a spider has, but they're somehow able to make their webs. It's just impossible. It's absolutely impossible. So if you think about the nature of science, a lot of the questions that they're dealing with are impossible. It's just so astonishing that the spider can create such a complex web. So why not? Is his way of thinking. Mm-hmm. So he considered it a likely possibility.
There's quite a bit of literature coming out these days in the area of insect and spider communication, suggesting something like a much more consciousness than we had anticipated, and maybe even something of a group consciousness. And
squid and cuttlefish and octopus in the ocean have their own special kinds of consciousness. It's amazing. The field of consciousness is a very, very interesting endeavor to get involved with. So I was trying to figure out, well, why do these expert scientists, most of them are not familiar with the literature. Yeah. And so in the questionnaire that I sent out, I asked them, what's the source of your information about parapsychology? And the most prevalent source is newspapers, strangely enough. Whatever they read in the newspapers, that influences their beliefs. But that didn't really influence in one direction or another. The thing that seemed to channel a scientist in one direction or another was the way the source which they considered most important. And so there's the a priori method of thinking to think that there's a kind of deductive process within science and certain things are self-evident. That leads to skepticism. The skeptic says there's a certain self-evidence that the phenomena can't occur, so therefore any kind of research in this area must be flawed. And then the other side of the coin was personal experience. The scientists who had personal experiences were believers, and the ones who didn't weren't believers. Mm-hmm. So this is what I came across in the questionnaire. And I also found that I asked them about their personal experiences, and that these elite scientists had a very low rate of personal experience, but the ones who hadn't had experiences, they believed in the phenomena. So it was an interesting topic, and I learned a lot from talking to the parapsychologists. And I also learned a lot from just sitting around in their offices while they were working, and the telephone would ring and people were calling them up and and wanting to tell them stories and hoping they would help investigate poltergeist phenomena. And, there's a phenomena going outside the laboratory, which I found fascinating and curiously prevalent. And no matter how much the parapsychologists might be rejected, this thing seemed to be going on. It's going on anyway.
Well, and we've done a prior interview about an extensive investigation of poltergeist-like phenomena that you were personally involved in with the Sorat group.
Well, that was the other issue. Right when I was interacting with, I was working on this manuscript. These people in Missouri, they were talking with the spirits, and the tables were levitating, and all this strange things was going. I had started doing haunting investigations because the parapsychologists were sending me these cases. Mm-hmm. They didn't have time, and so I was going out and talking to people who had hauntings in their house, and I could see that these are just regular folk. They're regular people, and I would suspect there's probably 10%, or probably the group of people who are listening to this program, there's probably like 20% of them who probably have active cases going on right now. It's just not that unusual thing. It was hard for me to imagine that this was possible, but obviously it was possible. People have these kinds of experiences. So I started having my students in my classes ask their friends and neighbors, because I wondered what kinds of experiences are people having? What's the most prevalent? What's the effect? What's the impact of these kind of things? And so I had my students from the University of Maryland, University of North Carolina, Greensboro, Elizabeth City State University in Northeast North Carolina. And then I couldn't get a job in the U.S. because I had this dissertation, which no one would. So I spent 4 years overseas. I was in, traveled all around Asia and went to the People's Republic of China. So I got a chance to pass out a questionnaire to 3 different colleges, college students at 3 different colleges in the People's Republic of China, and also in Japan. Mm-hmm. So it gave me a huge body of, these are all random samples, that they were a random sample of the population at the college.
Students.
Yeah, students at the college. And so we found that I created a kind of scale, and they were standardized questions that Andrew Greeley had used regarding extrasensory perception, contact with the dead, and out-of-body experience. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I created a kind of a Psi index or scale where we just sum those all together, and then we have some people who have a lot of experiences, some people who have very little, and the percentage of people who had scored high on the index there's a pretty standard variation. I mean, not much variation. In the United States, the University of Maryland had 22% high, percentage of experiencers, and Elizabeth City State had 13%. University of North Carolina, Greensboro, 13%, and the elite scientists only had 11%. They were pretty low, and the Japanese had 16%. It's a pretty secular society, but the Chinese had 54%. Over half of the Chinese students had a very, very high percentage of experience. And this was something which experts had told me was just absolutely impossible. They told me that this is in 1986 that they responded to this questionnaire, and that it was they had just gone through the Cultural Revolution about 10 years previously. It had gone on for about 10 years. And so these students had been children during the Cultural Revolution. And so they had been raised in an environment where it was impossible to practice religion. It was just totally unacceptable. And even while the questionnaire was being passed out, the government had a special program saying you're not allowed to believe in ghosts anymore. It can't be. We can't tolerate this. Uh-huh. So the issue is, the first question was, what's going to happen to me? Should I be arrested or not? And should these, there's a kind of investigation was launched, and my wife at the time saying, "Are we going to get out of this? Are we going to have to go to prison, or what's going to happen to us?" And I had the chance to interview Chinese parapsychologists, and they were having the same problem as the American parapsychologists. There's a stigma associated with what they were doing, and But the Chinese, I think it's kind of parallel to what happened in the United States. In the U.S., the CIA got interested, and so the whole thing got financed by our CIA. In the People's Republic, the Chinese military became interested, and so they collected the subjects and they began doing secret research there in the People's Republic of China. But it was very parallel and strangely similar. But it turned out they let me leave, and I trained graduate students. So they did 2 other studies after I left. And we got very, very consistent results. So the issue was why did they have such a high level of experience? And as the years went by, I came to the realization that these children had been raised in the Cultural Revolution. It must have been very traumatic for them, and it seems that trauma and struggle in childhood is a factor, very much a factor in creating dissociation, and dissociation leads to anomalous experience. It creates a propensity for anomalous experience, to be dissociative and to be absorptive, to have hypnotic capacity. It's related to anomalous experience.
And I would think the skeptics would argue, and maybe with some justification, that traumatic experience in childhood, the dissociation, could also lead them to formulate fantasies.
Well, yes, they're fantasy-prone people, and that helps them to cope with struggle. Now, it's psychologically we sociologists have done a few studies about fantasy proneness. There's a certain kind of psychological health associated with this. So the skeptic and the skeptics are somewhat lacking in these areas, and it generates a kind of lack of insight to think that fantasy proneness or dissociative ability to be able to ignore the unsolvable problems or troubling situations, that's actually quite valuable and psychologically healthy in a lot of areas.
Mm-hmm. But it is interesting to note, and other researchers have found this to be the case, that people who report a lot of spontaneous psychic experiences also report more than the average amount of trauma in childhood.
Yes, child abuse. And then not necessarily child abuse, but just childhood difficulty and adolescent difficulty.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's another factor that needs to be teased out. But one of the interesting things that you report on are the strategies used by parapsychologists to cope with the stigma that they're under.
Well, they want to confront the skeptics. They want someone to point out to them where the methodological errors are, and then they want to correct those methodological errors. So parapsychology has been pretty much in the forefront of statistics and statistical analysis, and the field is one of the first fields to engage in meta-analysis. And so it is, from my vantage point, it throws it into the realm of rhetorical and political process. In other words, the parapsychologists who are most established, at established centers, they then achieve prominence, and people such as myself who are out in the backcountry, we are able to putz around and do whatever we want, it would seem, and do some pretty strange things, it turns out.
Mm-hmm, because you're not being scrutinized, and nor are you receiving huge grants to do your work.
None whatsoever, or virtually none. Yeah. So I was interviewing people and gathering cases together, and I had my students do a kind of folklore research, in which they would ask, if you have ever had an extremely unusual experience, would you describe it? Because I wondered what are the kinds of things that people are having? What is the nature of this thing? Because it isn't actually just extrasensory perception. I notice there's a tendency to focus on that. We talk about remote viewing and the CIA investigating this or that, but I was wondering, what is it that people are actually having? My haunting people, I had not understood about sleep paralysis, but my haunting people were describing sleep paralysis cases where you wake up in the middle of the night and you can't move. And a lot of times a person feels a terrible pressure on their chest, like they can't breathe. And so this has given rise to the thought that there's a witch sitting on your chest or something like that. It's a folklore story. So the question is, what is it that will people story? If you've had a very unusual experience, would you describe it? Okay, so it makes for a kind of strange response for a lot of people. Like one of the Chinese students said, well, if I had a very unusual experience, I don't know whether I would describe it or not, because we're not allowed to have these things here.
It's better. Well, a lot of people, you've probably had this experience. I think every parapsychologist I know has had this experience, which is if you give a public presentation, someone is going to come up to you and want to tell you about their experience. And they usually preface it by saying, I've never told anybody else about this before.
Mm-hmm. And another student said, I've had a very unusual experience. I studied very hard for my exam, and my friend didn't study at all, and he got a very high grade, and I got a low grade. I find this to be extremely unusual.
Paranormal.
So well, they didn't have the word paranormal. That wasn't something they'd ever discussed or talked about. Yeah. So you see, you get a real spectrum of people's responses. So, but I did have just a lot of stories which I could categorize. And this is in Northeast North Carolina where I was gathering these stories. And the most prevalent kind of experience that people wanted to tell about was apparitions experiences. They saw apparitions. And the stories didn't really fit very well into what the parapsychologists were interested in, because there wasn't any element to the story which conveyed extrasensory perception or proved that there's life after death. Mm-hmm. But people saw apparitions. They would see something and then it would vanish before them, and it was an unusual form of perception. So we had 34% of these stories were apparitional stories. That was the main kind of story. The second one was paranormal dreams.
You mean like precognitive?
Well, yes, but they're not always precognitive. Sometimes they pertain to the present and sometimes they pertain to the past. But you're right. Generally, they were precognitive dreams. In other words, there's a dream which would occur in the future. The person wouldn't realize it. And then they're very, very complex and astonishingly beyond what you would think could happen through coincidence. Like, for example, at the University of Maryland, one of my students, I was asking them to we were doing a survey, a random sample survey, and we were passing out these questionnaires. This guy said that the night before, he had a dream that he was running through the parking lot at the shopping center close to his house, okay, and that someone was chasing him. Okay, so, and then in the morning he picked up the newspaper, and the guy had a very unusual name. Like his name was like, I'm just using a pseudonym, but his name was like Abraham Abramovich, And so he picked up the newspaper in the morning, and a bank robber had robbed the bank and was running through the parking lot, and the police pursued him and apprehended him in the parking lot. And his name was Abraham Abramovich.
Same name.
The same name as my student.
I see.
So that's the kind of coincidence. These paranormal dreams are very, very compelling. Mm-hmm. It's beyond what you could consider just coincidence. Then the third most common was psychokinesis. 9% were psychokinesis. Then spiritual healing was very prevalent. 6% spiritual healing. Then we had, this is Northeast North Carolina, so we had a lot of root bar stories. Yeah, it's like in New Orleans, they have voodoo or something like that. And this is a tradition that's brought from Africa, and it's been being conducted under the auspices of Christianity. And people were doing root lore curses and root lore healing. Then sleep paralysis, then waking extrasensory perception, and something I called synchronistic events. Things coincide, but we don't know why. And then there's like a miscellaneous category, an out-of-body experience, and UFOs. People would tell UFOs story. And so this seemed to be just something that's very prevalent and somewhat universal. Because I encountered the same stories all over the world, these types of stories,
So from a sociological perspective, what you've got is at the folk level, there's enormous interest and enormous reports of a wide variety of experiences, but at the level of organizations, institutions, the guardians of culture, these things are supposedly non-existent and even taboo to talk about.
And the question, of course, is the prevalence. What percentage of people are reporting these experiences? It's more than 50%. When you talk to people, some studies come up with about 2/3 of people will come up with a story. It depends on how you frame the question. So I decided to use some kind of standardized method for creating these questions. So I had a question about paranormal dreams, apparitions, spiritual healing, sleep paralysis, psychokinesis, out-of-body experiences, religious experiences, and other, and I found that 66% of people reported paranormal dreams. It's the majority. So we've got something very strange here. There's a severe stigma, but a majority of people have these kinds of experiences. It's a lot of people are aware of this, and a majority of people believe in it.
Well, I would think that it creates a real problem for the gatekeepers who are trying to suppress this data, because at least ostensibly they have a commitment to the empirical method, and you've got a situation now where you have hundreds of scientific experiments, typically using the standard methods of science, control groups, double blinds, statistics, and so on, coming up with data. Many people in the public reporting that they're having these experiences. How do the skeptics suppress this data in the face of their own commitment to science?
Well, that shows the way that you framed the question just then.
Yeah.
Shows that you apparently don't understand how science works. You're engaging in you've embraced scientism. The argument that science is this objective method which is ever and ever coming closer and closer to truth. But it turns out that science doesn't work like that. Science is like a church or a religion, and it has a hierarchy, and we human beings aren't necessarily rational. We're not rational people, and we want to create demarcations. We want to have it's us versus them, and so we need to create demarcations. And it turns out it's very easy for scientists to make this adjudication. If you try to do research in this area, you're not going to have much of a career, And that was just my experience as a sociologist. I wasn't going to be able to get a decent job, and I wasn't going to get a career. And that's a lesson. And if you go into the sociology of religion, it's this kind of a same phenomena. You'll gain support if you become an expert in, say, Catholicism, and then maybe you can get a job at a Catholic college, or if you have a born again orientation, then you can get a job at a Christian college. But you need to have an audience. There needs to be some kind of supportive audience. And so let's think of our young scientist in graduate school, and he's going to study insects. He needs to study insects in the right way. If you're going to go into sociology, you've got to do it in the right way. And if you go into this area, it's not acceptable. And it's similar to being a gay person or a member of a minority group. The majority has all kinds of different strategies to prevent you from really getting an equal opportunity. And we pretend like we have there's social justice, but there really isn't. There's a basic injustice associated with this human realm that we're living in these days. I had a chance to attend a seminar about slavery in America and slavery in Africa. Okay, because I have a lot of African American students, and so I had this grant, and I got to attend a seminar at the University of Virginia about slavery in America and Africa. And so I had gone through all the literature. There's a huge amount of literature about anomalous, unusual experience in Africa. Okay, out of body and religious experience in Africa, particularly in Nigeria and places which were a homeland for African Americans. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so I put together a journal article about this and tried submitting it. And I was told that, I got to hobnob and made friends with a lot of African sociologists, mm-hmm. Okay, African psychologists. Yeah. And a lot of them were very religious people. And they informed me that the way sociologists had studied them was somewhat offensive, that sociologists of religion were offensive because they referred to the reason that Africans had become Christianized is because it helped them gain commercial advantages and helped them maintain, contact with the outside world and help them make harmony within a colonial system. And there are all these sociological explanations. And they found this to be offensive because they believed that it was because of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit had come into their hearts, and that had explained why they believed the way that they did. It was a very sincere belief. So I submitted these journal articles, and the journal editors, they wanted to reject the articles. And I just mentioned to one of them that by the way, the way we normally do sociology is really pretty offensive, that my African friends were offended by this. And they wrote back and said, well, what you're doing is pretty offensive too. We're offended by it. We find what you're doing pretty offensive. We think sociology is doing exactly the right way, and if some people are offended, then too bad for them. But we're not going to publish your article about near-death experience and African folklore, because we find that offensive.
Yeah, built-in prejudice in sociology, sure.
Well, there's a kind of heuristic that explains this, and the heuristic is what I see is all there is. Like if I ask you a question, you search your memory. Say you ask me a question, I'm going to search my memory bank. And if I can't find it, then I can't believe that it really exists. So when you ask a person who's had a paranormal experience, they search their memory and there that experience is, so they can believe it. Yeah. But a skeptic doesn't have that experience. So when you follow that heuristic, what I see is all there is, the thing doesn't occur. It can't occur because it's not in my memory. I have not seen it, so therefore it can't really exist. And it makes life a lot simpler. To use this heuristic way of thinking.
Of course, for me, and I suspect for you as well, I have hundreds of paranormal-like experiences in my memory.
Well, but mine are a little bit too strange. I've been exposed to a little bit too. It's really kind of parallel to being in Vietnam. Actually, when I was in Vietnam, it was way off what was acceptable, it can't really be tolerated. Doesn't fit in. And so I realized I'm out of step. I'm out of phase with regular folk who haven't had those kinds of experiences. And it's hard for the non-believers and the believers to really, there isn't a good intersection for them. It's hard for them to understand each other.
Well, as Martin Luther King once said, the arc of justice is long, but it does eventually bend toward justice. And over time, one would think that, given enough time, that the errors and mistakes and folly all human beings have, that the scientific method should be capable of eventually correcting that.
Well, maybe, okay, so that's where you and I come in here. Yeah. No. So what is it that makes for success within the realm of science? So the first step would be to come up with some kind of theoretical orientation which generates, if we're going to play the game, we have to embrace scientism, okay? We have to accept the idea that science is a logical process. We have to come up with some kind of theory. Yeah. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking how the nature of consciousness, how did consciousness evolve within human evolution? Okay.
But let me step back for just a second, Jim, because I think you and I maybe have different definitions of scientism. I would identify scientism not with the embrace of the scientific method. To me, that's science, not scientism. Scientism, to me, is elevating the metaphysics, the ethos of science to a religion. And by that, I mean materialism.
Well, that's an acceptable definition that you just presented, but that definition irritates the scientists. Like the scientists who received my questionnaire, a lot of them were very much irritated. Some of them even wrote in the margins, I think that you're trying to hurt us in some way, you see.
Oh.
So your definition, you're trying to hurt the scientists because you're pointing out a kind of hypocrisy. And all of us humans have that. We humans engage in heuristics. Mm-hmm. We don't have time to think that deeply. I know you're trying to stimulate us. You're trying to get us to think. But we humans don't have time for that. We want to make short, easy, quick evaluations. Yeah. So if we think of science, like say I'm a sociologist, I need to learn what the correct methods are, follow those methods, and then maybe I'll be advancing my career. So if we're going to engage in science, we need to come up with a theory, a testable theory. And so now you can say that they already have one, say the Gansfeld method or the remote viewing method. You can generate a successful finding from that.
Yeah.
And it seems as if it's replicable.
The theory being that if you quiet the mind in some way, that produces enhanced scores.
Yeah. If you reduce your cognition, your brain, slow down your mind, or disrupt it through chanting or drumming. Yeah. You know. But so I'm a sociologist, and I lived in Asia, and I'm looking at these shamans. And they're doing that. They're chanting and drumming and going into trance. And yet when I watched them, the actual rituals weren't actually generating paranormal phenomena. Mm-hmm. You weren't actually, I could walk over hot coals myself, but it's not necessarily paranormal. It seems as if the phenomena has this hiding quality. Yeah. And I noticed that with my Missouri case, the entity letters, finally the book has come out. That book, I couldn't get that book published for decades, mm-hmm. But the phenomena has a hiding quality. And now certain researchers are able to get the phenomena. Hal Puthoff and Harold, Puthoff and Targ and Charlie Tart, they get good success. But a lot of researchers can't. And when I interviewed the parapsychologists, I found a lot of people couldn't really get the phenomena. That there's something different about the phenomena. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's think about human consciousness. What is this thing which we're shutting down? What are we closing down in order to gain this, to make this thing happen? And we notice, the ancient Homo sapiens actually had Homo erectus before. And they huddled around the fires, and they perhaps gained linguistic skill. And there must have been stages where they had some kind of symbolization. They gained a capacity to symbolize, and then they developed the capacity to develop a linguistic ability. Yeah. And they started painting their walls, mm-hmm. and in the 13,000 years ago, made an image of a shaman on the wall, or a kind of anthropomorphic animal man. Mm-hmm. So shamanism's been practiced for a long time, and shamanism would have a degree of effectiveness. It has a degree of effectiveness even today, and that's in the realm of spiritual healing. Spiritual healing has a degree of effectiveness. Right?
Yeah, all right.
We can agree. That's a replicable experiment, because we have we have hypnotic effect and we have placebo effect, yeah, right?
Right.
And that's we can count on it. It's a very, very replicable.
The placebo effect is, yes.
Yeah. And has such a powerful effect that it would have had evolutionary impact. Mm-hmm. This is what I'm thinking, It would have had, so those people living 30,000 years ago in their caves, they would have provided survival of benefits from the shamanic ceremonies.
So I think it's fair to say that they learned how to activate placebo effects.
Yes, and hypnosis.
Sure.
Because they had drums and flutes. They had they made music and they were dancing. They knew how to dance. Yeah. So people who but there's a differential rate of survival. Now, the skeptics would have been at a survival disadvantage.
Yeah.
They would have come down with an infection and died, or if they had a wound, they would have bled to death. Or probably childbirth was a very important factor. Childbirth was probably the most controllable disorder. People who responded to ritual healing during childbirth women would have had a survival advantage.
Yeah.
And so we find today women have a tendency to have a higher rate of anomalous experience, a higher rate of spontaneous experiences, and a higher level of belief.
You found that in your surveys.
The sociologists, and it's quite replicable.
Uh-huh.
And women tend to be more spiritual and more religious all over the world.
Mm.
So this theory coincides with that.
Yeah.
And the theory would have provided survival benefits to people who had dissociative ability and absorptive ability, the people who are more hypnotizable.
Yeah.
So we have a cycle of the people selecting for people who have the propensity for unusual experience. They would have a survival advantage.
Sure. I mean, all of that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So over time, we would have shaped our own capacity for spirituality. We would have, rather than becoming like chimpanzees who aren't very religious, we humans became spiritual. We became religious as a result of spiritual healing.
So what you're suggesting is that regardless of what parapsychologists call psi phenomena, that the social practices associated with magic, animism, shamanism had some survival value, and that's why they persisted. But that wouldn't explain why parapsychology as a science has persisted, would it?
Well, parapsychology as a science persisted because there's this huge percentage of people in the general, all populations all over the world have a huge percentage of these people who are having these experiences and are very curious. We're very curious. What's going to happen after we die?
Yeah.
And what could benefit us? What could help us live? What could help us to become happy and live to reach an old age? Yeah. We're very much interested in survival. And suppose you come down with a cancer or some terrible medical problem. What can you do about it? And the scientists tell you that they can't do anything. Is it possible that spiritual healing could be effective? Mm-hmm. And it seems the case that it could be effective. Yes, most definitely. So people are very interested in this, and the parapsychologists are shedding light on these questions. Mm-hmm. So
when you did your original work back in the 1970s, you mentioned there were some 30 parapsychology research centers.
Yeah.
Today, now, many decades later,
maybe 7.
Yeah. So in one sense, it seems as if the field has shrunk over time.
And that original theoretical model that I started out this presentation, it pointed out there needs to be lay groups who are supportive of the parapsychologists. When I traveled around and visited those parapsychologists, they didn't want to answer their telephones. People were calling them, but they were too busy doing their laboratory research. The people outside the laboratory were having the powerful experiences. They wanted something that they could relate to. Now, the ones that exist today, like there's groups which are interested in UFOs. There's groups that are interested in large-footed monsters. There's groups that are interested in near-death experiences and reincarnation. Mm-hmm. There's the people who are in tune with the general public are gaining support. So that seems to be, and you're gaining support. You're prospering.
I'm eking by, and I have to say this: I've never had much in the way of employment as a parapsychologist since I got my doctoral degree in the field in 1980. But I've had a great life. I don't regret 1 minute of it.
Because you're in harmony with what people want. You're fulfilling a need. People are interested in these programs, but I think also they love you personally. I think.
Well, I hope so.
Still as an interviewer.
But now, one of the things that intrigues me is that I do think that let's take psychology as an example. Psychologists have been the one profession that ought to be, in my opinion, the most interested in the findings of extrasensory perception and psychokinesis, but they've been really amongst the most hostile. But recently, the American Psychological Association has been, after a long hiatus of not even speaking about parapsychology, there have been several publications. They've published several books and articles in their flagship publication, The American Psychologist, favorable to parapsychology. So it strikes me that there's what's happening in our era right now is that, at least in the field of psychology, a very important scientific discipline, the gatekeepers are beginning to loosen up a bit.
Well, let's think about that. Let's think about, let's suppose you're a 17-year-old or an 18-year-old man or woman, and you're exposed to this information. What would be a career path for that person? If you go into psychology or sociology, you're going to be channeled into, like, sociology has not changed that much. I just was reading some recent work in sociology pertaining to this field, and they're still sticking to their tried and true paradigm, and they're not going to they're interviewing people who have haunting experiences, but there still is this category of deviant behavior. The people are portrayed as there's being something wrong with them.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that you don't think there's, in your lifetime, since you did this research decades ago, you don't think that there's really been any significant progress?
Well, there has been progress, yes. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to talk to you right now to try to point out how can this progress continue and how can it be made. So let's think about this list, these things: paranormal dreams, apparitions, spiritual healing, sleep paralysis, psychokinesis, out-of-body experience, religious experience, other waking extrasensory perception, near-death experience, and UFOs. So I had my students in my classroom. We have like a 1,800 stories. Okay, and I said, now which of these stories are the most interesting? Which of the stories are the most associated with psychological health? Which stories provide survival benefits? Which stories might we be able to use to go into the future and become successful if we're going to do research in these areas? And we're going to code every kind of each of the adjectives, whether they're positive and negative, within the people when they're telling the stories. And you look at, to say, apparitions and paranormal dreams. There's a lot of negativity within these stories. There's the fear. There's reason to be afraid. The people you have a dream, like, for example, here's a paranormal dream. The girl is saying she was watching her brother and her neighbor and her father. They were loading lawnmowers on the back of a truck, and one of the lawnmower, or the piece of equipment, fell over and it crushed. She couldn't see who it was, but someone was crushed to death. Like very negative. And a lot of the paranormal dreams are very, very negative, and a lot of apparitions are associated with a death, and especially a terrible death, a tragic death. And a sleep paralysis had to do with witches, a curse upon you, and the person feels like they're going to be killed. Psychokinesis oftentimes has to do with a death, a haunting. It has to do with like haunting cases a lot of times. The spirits come back, a restless spirit. Now, the out-of-body experiences, a lot of those are positive. The people feel they're in pain and they leave their bodies and they feel better, and that it's a kinship to a near-death experience. Those are half of them. A lot of them were negative, but some were positive. So now we're getting to something which has an interest. People are interested in life after death, and there's that thought, oh, this has to do with I have a soul and it can leave my body and I'll still be living. But the one kind of experience with spiritual healing, that is very, very positive. And the students felt that was the best kind of story. That was the story that they were most likely to tell other people. So we have a lot of folklore. How can you be healed? Let's suppose you have a burn. You should go visit a spiritual practitioner, and then they'll get a certain verse from the Bible, they'll read it, and your pain from your burn will go away, and it won't blister, and you will not have a scar. It's a wonderful, wonderful situation. Suppose you come down with cancer. Well, go have a prayer group in your church, and they pray for you every week, and the people told the story, and the cancer. Now, a lot of times they went to a doctor, and they had an operation. But a lot of times it doesn't work out. But in the story, it works out.
Yeah.
A wonderful, wonderful story.
Mm-hmm.
The people were healed.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a kind of a prescription for how you can live long and be happy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the pathway is mental health, figuring out how to combine this way of thinking. There's a certain population in our society who are they have a lot of these kinds of experiences. It's very prevalent, and they believe in spirits, souls, life after death, and magical abilities. And it's a psychologically healthy situation. And that, I think, and it makes for a psychologically healthy form of consciousness.
Yeah. So your advice to parapsychologists is to focus on healing.
Well, to recognize that there's certain benefits, and that the people who have these propensities, some of them have attained very psychologically healthy ways of thinking, and that allows a model for the rest of us, mm-hmm. a way of thinking about things, using your dissociative ability and using your absorptive ability, and creating rituals which are beneficial to people. That's going to be the pathway. And you've interviewed a lot of people who are doing that kind of thing, I think, on your program.
Yeah.
Really, yeah. A lot of people.
It's true. I haven't tried to avoid those other scary areas. I enjoy all of it myself.
Yeah.
But I think that's excellent advice. Well, Jim, this has been a fascinating discussion. You've really given me some pause. I sometimes get over-optimistic. I think I was incredibly optimistic in the 1970s that parapsychology was going to revolutionize everything then and there. And now I can look back from the vantage point of decades later and say it hasn't happened yet. I'm still optimistic that eventually that revolution will come, but maybe not.
Well, it's a little bit disconcerting to live in a time where our own government is engaging in atrocities, and it doesn't bode well for the future. But the idea that tribulation and social difficulty, it seems to stimulate this kind of phenomena. There's a reaction. The people that lived through the Cultural Revolution and the People's Republic of China, that was very, very difficult for them. But they came out of it with this capacity for these kinds of experiences. It brings the problem itself is kind of like the Tao Te Ching. The problem there's a kernel of the solution will
embedded
arise.
In the problem. Yeah. Uh-huh. So, Jim, what are your current research interests?
Well, I'm curious about people in foreign countries and different countries who are interested in this kind of thing, who are interested in paranormal phenomena or these kinds of experiences. And so if you're living in some place, anywhere, go ahead and you might send me a post or an email or something like that. Because I'd be interested in creating contacts with people from a lot of different places. Because there's common features all over the world, but there's also different special cultural variations all over the world. It's very interesting to look at that, to see how the cultural variations are.
Well, we'll link to your website. If people check the comments section on this video, we'll link there to your website so people can reach you through your website. And you might also check the comments section yourself, because a lot of viewers just post comments and some of them may say they'd like to reach out to you. So I hope as a result of this video that you do make some interesting contacts in exotic countries.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It'll be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this time with me, Jim. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for having me.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the new Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.